So when I first started thinking about this sermon and how I would be coming back from vacation, in the new year and preaching on Epiphany, I thought by then I will have just come back from a pretty significant road trip, just like the wise men. So maybe I'll just make that connection, something like lessons learned from the journey. And I know that you'll be glad to know that we did survive 2,000 miles in the minivan with 2 kids, 7 and under. And we did actually learn a lot of things. But I think I'm going to keep them in my pocket for another time, because I have to tell you, when I got back from our trip and I really sat down to read this text again, kind of prepare to talk to you a little bit about it, I had a kind of revelation, an epiphany, I guess we could say. And my epiphany was, no, that isn't it at all. That isn't it at all. I went to Palm Springs, California to see my cousins and swim in the pool. And the folks described in this story undertook a perilous search for nothing short of a new world order. Right? They're like a little bit different. This wasn't like a joyride, right, that the Magi were on. It was a quest, an odyssey. This is Frodo with the ring, or like Jason looking for the golden fleece or something, right? Some journey that's so compelling it couldn't be avoided, a journey that was a matter of life and death. I started thinking about that a little bit, about how my initial intuitions about this story had been kind of wrong. And I really came to see, as I so often do when I return to texts I've known for a long time, that my understanding of this story is mostly grounded in assumptions that I think are misguided. I think we tend to do that. We wear the edges off a little bit when we get really familiar with these things. What I tend to have in mind when I think about the Magi is a very sanitized Hallmark movie version. The one where these kings appear. There's always 3 of them, and they're kind of multi-ethnic, and they're on their camels, and they come and they have a baby shower for Jesus under a clear starry night, and then they go home. Like, if you actually are listening, if you're listening to what Karen was just reading, the story is a lot more mysterious than that, and it's a lot more grave, especially if you keep reading a few verses beyond this. It's not a cute tale, actually. And probably the people involved with it would be surprised to find it on the face of many of our Christmas cards, wishing each other a happy holiday. Like, here's one thing I think we've probably gotten a bit wrong, and it's about the star. Like every picture I've ever seen of the Nativity, it's like a honking huge star, like a C-17 coming in for a landing. But here's what I'm wondering, like, if it was so big, why couldn't anybody see it? Other than this handful of Eastern nomads? Nobody could see it. There's no evidence in the story anybody else can see this. Herod and his goons, they don't see it. They go by the prophecy and the timing of the birth. They can't look out there and see it. If it was so big, why isn't everybody out looking for the new king jackpot like the people were playing Mega Millions a few weeks ago, right? Because they saw that huge star. They weren't. And maybe it wasn't. We tend to think of it like it's a really obvious sign because that's the image we see, but the story really points to the fact that what led the Magi to the Christ child might have been just almost imperceptible to anyone else, except to the ones for whom it was burning inside them, right? It's almost imperceptible. Here's another thing I was wrong about while we're on the topic of things I was wrong about. I'd always just kind of assumed, and I'd be interested to hear what you think about this, that the Magi didn't know that Herod was kind of an evil dude. I don't know why, but the way I always heard this story growing up, it sounded like they just sort of like wandered into the area like holding a map and just happened to bump into Herod, and we're like, hey, does anybody happen to know where this new, better king is? We can't find him anywhere. Do you know? I mean, it really, all my life, it's really read like a melodrama. It's like the villain Herod strumming his fingers in the background behind his fake mustache. And like people are throwing popcorn at him as he's like, I know what to do. I'm going to pretend that I want to worship the baby king, and then I'll get them to tell me how to find him. You know? But I was thinking about this week. That can't possibly be right. It is inconceivable to me that travelers in the ancient world would have ever assumed that any old Roman governor they came across was likely to be a safe, nonviolent, unparanoid person that could be consulted for advice about a rival authority. Like, that's just not realistic. The Roman Empire was a vast system of imperial forces, and its territory was ruled by autocrats who maintained power through manipulation and violence, right? No one on the road in those days would have been unaware of that fact. And if they were, it's unlikely they would have been alive long enough to say the word star. Surely Herod's reputation as a brutal and distrustful megalomaniac would have preceded him. Which, if you think about it, means that the only reason the Magi would have sought out his counsel was if there was no other way for them to find what they were looking for. And I was thinking about that for a few minutes. They were willing to put themselves in the gravest peril to get to the Christ child. I don't know about you, that kind of makes the story a little bit more ominous to me, but also a little bit more challenging to me as a person of faith. The scholars are also quick to tell us that this story, at least for the author of Luke, is there to foreshadow the inclusive nature of the gospel, showing that even from his birth, folks outside Jesus' own Jewish world would come to follow him. But they don't often note that this opening act in the Jesus story also indicates just how radical such a journey might be, and just how high the stakes of such a conversion are and were. And I tell you all this not to disabuse you of the joy you get when we sing We Three Kings. I love my Crush's Three Camels as much as the next gal. But I believe that thinking about this story in a new way may deepen our understanding of its invitation in a way that is particularly relevant right now. You know, we are facing a new year, and in many ways, a new reality. And it seems a reasonable time to remind ourselves of two insights from this story read on its own terms. And the first is that discerning God's guidance may take a little bit of work. Listening to God's summons and figuring out which way God is leading us isn't always going to be angels and trumpets popping out of the night sky with neon signs saying, "This way to the manger." Sometimes learning to follow God can be nothing more than an intuition. It can be something no one else sees, something that might seem obvious and then fade, requiring our perpetual attention. Inside the church, we use the word discernment to talk about this spiritual work, the work of going on a journey to find what God is leading us toward. And I keep having this sense, I just keep returning to this word discernment as I think about the year ahead. I think it's going to be more important than ever that we learn this critical discipline in the days to come. I think Presbyterians are very skilled at decision making. I wonder if we might have a way to go with discernment. And this applies to our life personally and collectively. It's about whether we're just trying to figure out our vocation, or whether we're working through some change in our life, or whether we're kind of deciding collectively how we want to be active in this world, how we want to protect the people that we've committed to protect and give justice to those that we're committed to standing beside. You know, working through prayer, study, discussion, and fellowship, we can be guided toward what we are called to be and do. And the way we do that is discernment, but it takes some work. It's not as obvious as maybe we've always thought it was. And that's a single invitation. I think the second invitation I hear in this passage is a bit more challenging. And that lesson is that true faith often involves risk-taking. You know, if we were raised in a rather comfortable position as maybe part of a dominant culture system that shares our faith, this may or may not be our direct experience. Coming to church may always have felt comfortable. But when we look at the biblical witness and the histories of all the luminaries in our tradition, we see that if we truly open our hearts to the presence of Christ, it changes us. It makes us bold and courageous, and it makes us willing to take risks in order to pursue the new life to which God has called us. And I just feel like perhaps it may be time for us to get really comfortable with that idea, that true faith involves risk, that true faith involves living differently and traveling a new territory, that true faith involves engaging with the powers of the world, even if they don't have our best interest at heart, that true faith involves putting everything we've got on the line to find this new world order that's been promised to us, right? It takes risks. Jesus taught us that. Note that the wise men didn't bring him swaddles and a bouncy chair. They brought him gifts to prepare him for tumultuous rule as king and an untimely death, right? Faith takes risks. And this is the path we've chosen because it's the one that we know, if we read to the end of the story, leads to life. And we know that we may not ever be able to go back to how things were, but we know that we can go forward into how things should be. We know that for us too, this is a quest, it's an odyssey, it's not a joyride. And the Magi were just the beginning of the story. Now in a few moments, we're going to come forward to communion and have an opportunity to also pick our star words for the year. They'll be available on both sides of the chancel. And as always, you're invited to accept this word in whatever way makes sense to you in this moment, right? As a way to consider a suggestion, it could be an affirmation, it could be a guide. But also add that you could see it as a way to consider how you are being called to journey toward God in this time. And maybe if this speaks to you and your word fits it, a way to think about what kind of risks you might be summoned to take in that quest and what kind of risks we might be summoned to take together. Because we're on the road together. We're looking to the stars together, and God is writing a story there that's not over and that involves us in a critical way. I think that's the good and sobering news of this day and of this whole tradition of Epiphany, that a star this large burns in our hearts and burns in our midst. And so we celebrate that today. And I ask that God would add a blessing to our understanding and our summons, the God who made us, redeemed us, and sustained us always. Amen.